My son arrived from Portland with a printed itinerary that already had my name on it. He hadn't told me he was coming. He and his wife Rebecca had bought the tickets 6 days after he found an email in a shared family account, one I had linked to an old laptop I gave him years ago and never thought to disconnect. The email was from a property attorney in Iloilo. One paragraph. A question about long-term land use arrangements for foreign residents. I had drafted it, decided to think it over, then forgotten I hadn't deleted it. Nathan had read it. Then he had spent 6 days reading everything else he could find. On his first evening in my apartment, he laid a printed return itinerary on the coffee table between us. Not a question, a reservation. My name in the passenger field, his credit card in the billing column, a seat leaving in 3 days. He said, "Dad, I need you to tell me what's actually happening here." My name is Gerald. I was 67 years old, a retired construction project manager from Portland, Oregon, and I had been living in Iloilo City in the Philippines for 14 months when my son flew over to bring me home. My wife Margaret passed away 27 months before I left. We had been married for 31 years. After she died, Nathan called every Sunday without missing one. His wife Rebecca sent prepared meals for the first several months. Packed carefully in containers, she drove to the post office herself. They invited me to their house. They included me in their boys' school events. I was never in any doubt that they loved me. But love and presence are not the same thing, and somewhere in the second year of being alone, I stopped being able to confuse the two. I started waking before 5 every morning, not because I had anywhere to go, because the house was so quiet that staying in bed made it worse. I made coffee I didn't need, and sat at the kitchen table watching the light move across the yard Margaret had planted. Some mornings I drove to the hardware store simply to be around other people making decisions. On the way back I took the long routes, not because I was lost, because coming home meant confirming there was nothing waiting for me when I got there. Nathan and Rebecca had full lives 30 minutes away. 2 sons in elementary school, careers, a mortgage. I was loved and I was welcome, and I was, without anyone intending it, an item on a schedule. Moving to the Philippines was not something I did impulsively. I had managed construction projects for 35 years. Impulsive decisions cost contractors money, and I had spent a career avoiding them. I researched for the better part of a year. I read forums. I read accounts from American retirees in Iloilo about the healthcare system, the cost of living, the practical difficulties. I read the bad stories alongside the good ones, and I tried to assess honestly which category my situation was more likely to fall into. When I finally booked a flight, I had arranged for a property management company to handle the rental of my Portland house. I kept a dedicated emergency account in a U.S. bank that nothing else touched. I paid for only the first month of my Iloilo apartment before arriving. I told Nathan I was going to try something new while I was still healthy enough to try it. He asked if there was a woman involved. There wasn't. That answer seemed to unsettle him more than any other explanation would have. What I couldn't explain well enough was the thing underneath all of it. I wasn't running from anything. I was trying to find out whether there was still a version of my life that felt like it belonged to me, rather than like a placeholder for a life that had already ended. The first weeks in Iloilo were harder than I had prepared for. The heat in late March was physical in a way no amount of reading had conveyed. The traffic moved according to patterns I couldn't decode. Simple tasks, locating a pharmacy that carried my blood pressure medication, understanding how my electricity meter worked, buying produce without paying 3 times the going rate, took twice as long as they should have. But something happened during all that fumbling. For the first time in 2 years, I was fully occupied by the present. I was not sitting in a quiet house thinking about the past. I was trying to figure out how a tricycle fare worked. I found the morning market during my 3rd week. I went because the supermarket near my apartment was expensive and inefficient. I went back the next morning because the experience had been unexpectedly human. Vendors who called out, who noticed when I pointed at the wrong pile of mangoes, who corrected me in a way that didn't embarrass me. That was where I met Danilo. He was near the fish section, in a cheerful argument with a vendor about something wrapped in banana leaf. He was 63 years old, a retired barangay captain, and he spoke English the way men who have conducted official business in it for decades speak it, directly, without performance. When he saw me standing nearby looking uncertain, he said without introducing himself, "The one on the left is today's. That one is yesterday's. You want the left." We had coffee afterward at a small place nearby. Then the next morning. Within a few weeks, the pattern had established itself the way good patterns do, without anyone deciding on them. Danilo's wife Cora worked as a school administrator. They had 3 adult children and a house that took 15 minutes by tricycle from my apartment. The first Sunday they invited me to lunch. I stayed 3 hours. I left only because I thought I was overstaying. Cora put another plate in front of me and told me to stop counting the hours. I want to be accurate about what the friendship was. Danilo and I argued about basketball and local governance, and the correct way to pour concrete in tropical humidity. Cora fed me on the days I looked like I hadn't eaten properly. Their youngest daughter, who worked at a call center, occasionally asked me to help her practice formal American English for client interactions. I helped because it interested me, not because anyone asked me to. I was not a project to them. I was a person who had arrived in their part of the world and become, in the gradual way these things happen, familiar. From Portland, Nathan read what I sent him and saw something different. He saw a 67-year-old man living alone in a foreign country, increasingly surrounded by people his son had never met, who were becoming more present in his life than his own family. 3 things happened before Nathan bought the tickets. First, I contracted dengue fever. It lasted 11 days. Danilo drove me to the nearest hospital, handled the intake process, and visited on 3 separate occasions while I was there. The physician was competent and unhurried. The bill for the full admission was less than $400. I recovered without complications. I did not tell Nathan while it was happening, because the situation was already being managed, and I did not want to create alarm about something that was already resolving. I planned to tell him once I was well. Second, my phone dropped into a bucket of water I was using to clean the balcony. It stopped working. I borrowed a neighbor's phone and called Nathan, but he didn't recognize the number and let it go to voicemail. I left a message. He did not hear it in time, and for 4 days received nothing from me. 4 days of silence, following weeks in which I had already been calling less than before, was enough to make him fear the worst. Third, he found the email to the property attorney. The draft I had never sent, sitting in the shared account, the email asked about a small land use arrangement, a plot behind a community agricultural cooperative where I had been helping with an irrigation project. Less than 200 square meters. No structure. No investment to speak of. Something to do with my hands. To Nathan, the email read like his father was preparing to disappear permanently. He didn't call to ask. He bought 2 tickets. Nathan and Rebecca arrived on a Wednesday evening. I met them at the apartment. Rebecca hugged me. Nathan looked at the apartment the way I used to look at a building before writing my inspection report. He checked whether the front door had a deadbolt. He looked at the stairwell outside my unit. He asked whether the building had a night watchman. When I showed him the emergency supplies I kept, flashlight, spare medications, a charged battery bank, he made a sound I couldn't interpret as approval or its opposite. Within the first hour, the dengue came out. Not because I brought it up, because Danilo stopped by to drop off something Cora had sent, and mentioned in passing, easily, without thinking, that my color was much better than it had been 3 weeks ago. The room went quiet in a particular way. Nathan looked at me. I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked why I hadn't called him from the hospital. I told him I hadn't wanted him to fly across an ocean for something that was already being treated. He said, "That's the same answer you always give. That's the answer you give when you don't want me involved." I didn't respond to that, not because he was wrong. The next morning, Nathan asked to review my bank accounts. I told him no. He said he needed to verify that no unauthorized transfers had been made. I told him I had overseen construction budgets in the tens of millions and had managed my own finances since before he was born, and that I was not going to open my personal accounts to demonstrate I wasn't being swindled. Rebecca, who had been sitting quietly near the window, stepped onto the balcony. Nathan stood with his hands in his pockets. He didn't raise his voice. He said, "Dad, for 4 days I thought you might be dead." I wasn't. I know that now. I didn't know it then. We sat in that for a moment. That evening I told him I was not going home with him. I told him that what I had built in Iloilo was not a delusion I was defending out of stubbornness. It was my life, and I would show it to him over the next 2 days if he was willing to look at it with the possibility that he might be wrong about what he would find. He agreed to 2 days. The next morning I took them to the market. Danilo was already there. He greeted Nathan with a handshake and spent the next half hour answering every question. Nathan had been afraid to ask me directly how we met, whether I had ever lent money, whether any documents had my name on them, what had happened at the hospital. Danilo answered everything plainly. He produced his phone and showed Nathan the message thread from the day I was admitted. Timestamps, the physician's name, photographs of the discharge paperwork. Then Danilo said, "If my father were living far from home and a man I didn't know called himself his friend, I would want to know everything you are asking. You are right to ask." Something in Nathan's posture changed. Not completely, but enough. I spent the afternoon opening my finances. 14 months of statements. The Portland rental income flowing into the U.S. account. The retirement deposit each month. The expense column, rent, utilities, groceries, transportation. The hospital bill, everything recorded in a spreadsheet I had kept since the first week, because I wanted to know whether the plan was working. Nathan sat with the laptop for nearly an hour. He found nothing that surprised him, except, possibly, how little I was spending and how carefully I had structured it. He closed the laptop. He said, "This is more organized than what I have at home." "I had a lot of time to set it up," I said. He almost smiled. That evening, Cora had us all for dinner. There was no performance in it. We ate curry and rice and something fried that I had never learned the name of, despite asking 3 times. Rebecca helped Cora carry plates and ask questions about the cooking in the way people do when they're genuinely curious. Danilo's youngest grandson found Nathan's wristwatch interesting and spent 20 minutes being shown how the clasp worked. Nobody was auditioning for anything. It was a Wednesday evening and we were all just there. On the walk back, Nathan was quiet for several blocks. Then he said the thing I hadn't known he was carrying. "You know what I kept thinking during those 4 days?" He paused. "I didn't know what your daily routine looked like. I didn't know who would notice if something went wrong. And then I realized I didn't know those things when you were 30 minutes away either." I waited. "You were always working when I was a kid. Always in the middle of some project somewhere else. I learned not to expect you to pick up when I called. I learned to leave messages you'd return when you got to a good stopping point." He looked at the sidewalk, and now I'm still doing that. Still waiting. From the other side of the world now. I stopped walking. "I'm not angry about it," he said. "I'm just telling you. I came here because for 4 days I had no idea whether you were alive, and the person who did know wasn't me. It was someone I'd never met. I had carried for years the belief that Nathan had made peace with how often the work had taken me away. That practical men make peace with practical facts. I had told myself he understood. He did understand. That wasn't the same as it not having mattered. I told him I was sorry, not for moving to the Philippines. For the years I had made him an expert at waiting to hear from me. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Just don't do it again." "I won't," I said, and I meant it in a way the return ticket would never have solved. The next morning, Nathan and Rebecca did not bring up the flight. Nathan asked instead whether he could come with me to the cooperative. I showed him the irrigation line I had been helping map, a basic gravity-fed system for a section of the garden that lost too much water in the dry months. He looked at it the way engineers look at problems. He asked a few questions about the grade. Then he picked up a stake and started marking intervals while I talked through the layout with the cooperative's manager. We worked there for 2 hours. Nathan didn't say much, but he was present in a way he hadn't been since he arrived. Not looking for evidence of something wrong, just standing next to me while we figured something out together. Before they left, we made a list, an emergency contact plan shared with Danilo, listing both Nathan's number and Rebecca's. A backup phone kept charged in the top drawer. A commitment from me. The next time I was sick, I would say so the same day. Not after recovery, not once things had resolved the same day. A commitment from Nathan that unanswered calls would be treated as missed calls, not disappearances, unless a full 24 hours passed without contact. At the airport, Rebecca asked Cora for the curry recipe. Danilo shook Nathan's hand and told him the irrigation project would be finished by December if he wanted to come back and see it. Nathan laughed, briefly, genuinely, in a way I hadn't heard since he arrived. At the gate, he turned to me. "Next time I want to come as your son," he said, "not as whoever I was this trip." "You were my son this trip too," I said. "You just didn't know it yet." I watched them pass through security. Then I walked back to where Danilo had parked. He didn't ask how it had ended. He asked if I was hungry. Cora had left a container on the back seat before she went to work. I had spent 14 months learning to live in a city that had been difficult and imperfect, and worth every difficult, imperfect day of it. My son had crossed half the world to end that. What he found when he arrived was not the story he had prepared for. He found that I had finally learned to stay somewhere, that I had finally become the kind of man who answered when someone knocked on his door. It just took moving somewhere that people knocked.